Tonight, we are dealing with a subject sadly becoming more and more familiar to many of us, Alzheimer's disease. Professor Cindy Weinstein was in her 20s when she heard from her mother that her father had this dreaded disease. Now, 30 years after his death, she has partnered with the noted neurologist, Dr. Bruce L. Miller, to co-author Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief, and the brain. They are being interviewed by Caltech professor Catherine Yurka. Following this conversation, we will host a question and answer session where you too can join the conversation. Having lost my own mother to Alzheimer's 17 years ago, I found the personal recollections and the science in the book very informative and fascinating, while forcing me to look at my own unasked and unanswered questions related to having a dear one fall victim to this horrible fate. I am sure that many of you will similarly be touched. Those who have family or friends with Alzheimer's will come to know that they are not alone as they support the ones that they love. If you're interested in asking a question, please indicate in the chat or Q&A section on your screen. If you don't wish to ask directly, you can post your question there, and our house manager, Corinne Shore, will be coordinating that part of the program. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Catherine Yurka, Professor of English in Caltech's Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, to introduce our two authors. Professor Yurka got her PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1995 before joining the Caltech faculty that same year. Professor Yurka?
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here to introduce the authors and to serve as moderator for the first part of this conversation for tonight's Behind the Book. Finding the Right Words is really a remarkable collaboration, and I'm excited to congratulate the authors because the publication date for this book was just 2 days ago, so that's wonderful. Cindy Weinstein, in addition to being a wonderful colleague, is the Eli and Edith Broad Professor of English at Caltech and an internationally recognized scholar of American literature. She is also completing her second term as Vice Provost and is the Institute's Chief Diversity Officer. And if I may say, it has been a remarkably successful 2 terms indeed. Cindy has been a proud member of the Humanities and Social Sciences Division at Caltech since 1989, during which time she has written several books on American literature. Finding the Right Words, though, is a departure from her previous academic work. It's a memoir about a father's early onset Alzheimer's, told from the point of view of a daughter and a scholar of literature and language. In order to write this book, Cindy studied neurology for a year with Bruce Miller while on fellowship at the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. That year gave her the language she needed to find the right words and the right way to tell the story of her father's dementia and the complicated nature of her grief. Bruce Miller is a researcher, clinician, and teacher, and holds the A.W. and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professorship in Neurology at UCSF, where he also directs the Memory and Aging Center. Until recently, most cases of dementia were classified as Alzheimer's disease, with little awareness of the importance of non-Alzheimer's dementias. Bruce's research has improved the separation of various neurodegenerative diseases from one another, in particular Alzheimer's disease from frontotemporal dementia. He has also pioneered groundbreaking changes in the provision of care coordination for patients with dementia and their caregivers. In 2015, partly in response to research findings showing that 30 to 40% of dementia cases could be eliminated with lifestyle changes, He helped found the Global Brain Health Institute and the Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health program, which he now co-directs. Bruce has been featured in Fortune magazine and the New York Times, as well as on 60 Minutes, the PBS NewsHour, and other meetings. Greetings to you both. Thank you for agreeing to share your book and experiences with the Caltech community. So, Cindy, as I noted in the introduction, this book is so different from the academic writing that English professors usually produce. And I wanted to ask you, why did you want to write this book? And also, what was your dad like?
Before I answer the question, I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening, for being so supportive of this project. Michael, your team, you've all been tremendous. Caroline Priolo, Sarah Weinstein, it's really taken a village to put this together and to write, finding the right words. Why did I want to write this book? When I was in my 20s and got the call from my mother that my father had Alzheimer's, it came at a very important moment in my intellectual development. I was in my third year at Berkeley in the English department getting a PhD. And I was studying for my orals. And if anyone in this room recalls that experience in the humanities, you're constantly reading books and taking books in and learning new words. And the synchronicity of my father's initial clinical presentation was the loss of language. And combined with my accumulation, vacuum-like, of books and words, this synchronicity has been something that I really wanted to think about and write about. And it took me a very long time to figure out how to write about that. But basically, the idea was, how do I come to terms with the fact that I am becoming what I hope was an expert in language as my father was losing words. So that was what made me want to write the book. And that was the first chapter that I wrote, the chapter on word finding. And then why did it take the form that it took? I think a lot of it has to do with being at Caltech, where people organize their lives not by the Scarlet Letter and Moby Dick, but according to cells and polymers and string theory, and a whole different vocabulary than the one I had grown up with and used to organize the way I thought about the world. And I had this hunch that turned out to be true, that as helpful as language of literature was in terms of me understanding what my father was going through, it wasn't enough. And I thought, I think science may be the way to go. And I had this wonderful moment in Bruce's office. I sent him an email a few years before I ended up at UCSF, and Bruce said, come on down to the Memory and Aging Center. And we really hit it off. And he said to me, do you want to learn some science? And I said, yes. And he said, let's have you apply to the Global Brain Health Institute. And in learning neurology and in learning this other language, it helped me write the book the way I wanted to. I wanted to get outside of the way I had been thinking about my father and his disease, which ended up being, as I say in the book, a kind of hall of mirrors. And I wanted to understand what was going on in my father's brain and move the perspective from me to him, which is where it needed to be. And Bruce helped me do that.
So Bruce, I've been at Caltech for 25 years. I'm also married to a scientist. And so I know that this book is also incredibly different from the typical scientific publication. And I wanted to know what made you want to take a chance on Cindy as a fellow and co-author? What was it about her story and her father's story that really spoke to you?
Yeah, well, I just reflecting on this incredible Caltech community. I was at UCLA about 25 years ago and got to interact with some of your great scientists. But I've gotten to see what a vibrant and cohesive community is writing this book with Cindy. And so I admired Caltech. Cindy is by any means a very distinguished person. So when she wrote me, I was interested, but she also was incredible fun, really had a mission to do. And there wasn't a chance in the world that I could turn her down. And I turned out to be the lucky one in this process because I learned so much. I would say it was a joyous collaboration almost from the first words that we wrote together.
That's wonderful. Cindy, I had the good opportunity to write you a letter of recommendation when you applied for the fellowship. And that it's always nice to be able to sing the praises of one's mentor. Cindy arrived, I'm not sure if you did the math, but she arrived at Caltech 6 years before I did and hired me in American literature. And I was really struck by the idea of the program that you were entering, the idea of people from very different disciplines and parts of the world coming together to learn about dementia and then take that knowledge back home. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what it was like to be a fellow at GBHI, and what were your fellows like, and how did you all interact and learn from each other as well as from Bruce and the other scientists at the center?
It was a magical year at UCSF, I have to say, and the Global Brain Health Institute program, it's co-located. So there were about 14 of us in San Francisco and about 14 at Trinity College in Dublin. And I knew this was going to be an interdisciplinary group, and that was one of the appeals of being a part of this cohort. I didn't know that I would make friends for the rest of my life with these people. They were extraordinary. There was one woman who works on something called architectural gerontology, and she looks at spaces where people with dementia find themselves, whether that's a nursing home or an emergency room, and tries to tailor those spaces so that they're dementia friendly. Another woman I met from Botswana had been trained in Australia and was the only neuropsychologist in Botswana. She came to UCSF to be a part of the program to learn state-of-the-art neurology at UCSF and then go back to Botswana and create more neuropsychologists at her university. The people in Trinity, some come to mind. There was this one woman from Brazil who worked on, this is going to sound a little counterintuitive perhaps, she worked on clowning and how when you're a clown, you don't make any mistakes, and encouraging people with dementia to learn how to be clowns and to laugh and to bring humor into their lives. The enormous creativity of the cohort was just tremendous. It was great to be around. I learned so much about non-scientific approaches to dementia. There was one woman in the UCSF program who worked on dance and dementia. And I also learned about the science of dementia. We had neurologists, general practitioners, geriatricians from all over the world. And what did I contribute to this group? I had the opportunity to work with some of the people at UCSF for whom English was not their first language. And one of the most gratifying parts of my time was seeing the progress that this one woman from Ecuador made with her English, another woman from Peru. I worked closely with them on their writing assignments. I ended up being a co-author with this woman who's a geriatrician in Mexico. I got so much out of it. It's really, I could spend the whole time talking about that. It was an opportunity both to sit in on seminars that were taught by some of the best scientists and neurologists in the world to learn about dementia. I went to grand rounds at 8 in the morning on Fridays and spent most of my time looking up the words that I didn't understand. Spent a lot of time with Google. And then one of the best things I got to do was I got to kind of be a medical student for a year, and I shadowed doctors and got to sit in on conversations that they had with patients and their families, and had the opportunity to see how much progress had been made since my father's diagnosis in the 80s.
Bruce, can I ask you to answer a version of the same question? What is it that this range of fellows brings to you and helps with your understanding of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia?
Well, I'm really a passionate educator and teacher, and Chuck Feeney, who is, I think, as unusual as this fellowship program is, Chuck Feeney is even a more unusual philanthropist. He's given away $8 billion and doesn't have his name on any building, we asked him if he could name the fellows after him, and he said that's not what giving's about. So when I started talking with Chuck Feeney and his representative, Chris Exley, I said, well, we really have great neurologists and neuroscientists at UCSF. And that wasn't exactly what Chuck and Chris were interested in. They were really interested in underserved populations. And they wanted, around the time that we started planning, data came out that about a third of people with dementia have potentially preventable risk factors that they never ever thought about. And this is particularly a big problem in underserved countries, underserved communities. So so Chuck Feeney loves San Francisco, he loves Dublin, he's an Irish American. And he said to my friend there, Ian Robertson, and I, design program that changes the lives for people who are underserved, protect their brain health. And they also pushed us in a way that I think was brilliant, which is, they said, well, you scientists don't communicate your illnesses very well. If you really want to make an impact with the public, you must engage artists. This I really resonated with, and I've learned more and more how important it is to have health economics people who can speak to politicians about the cost of these illnesses. Brilliant literary people like Cindy, who can tell these stories so that people understand what an important problem this is. And so the fellows are just incredible. They are in multidisciplines. They come from all over the world. Cindy's work that she talked about with a woman from Peru and Ecuador, these are indigenous physicians who work with indigenous peoples of Ecuador and Peru. And I think this has really started to have a huge impact in these countries. And it's one of the most gratifying things I've ever had. But I'd also say writing with Cindy was one of the most gratifying things that I've ever done.
Cindy, to go back to the literary side of things again, the memoir is an incredibly popular form of contemporary literature. And I was just wondering what memoirs were important to you as you were writing this or thinking about writing this, and which ones influenced your approach to this very personal material.
In addition to attending classes and grand rounds and interacting with the cohort, I spent a year reading, which was wonderful, and focused on memoir in order to have a better idea of what I wanted my memoir to look like, sound like. And one of the first things I read was Stephen King's book on writing. And that was really quite interesting. And I think if there were a model memoir that I was striving to get just sort of close to, it would be Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, which is an extraordinary book about a brutal year in Joan Didion's life, where she lost her husband and her daughter was in an emergency room for many, many months and almost died. And also Helen McDonald's book, H is for Hawk. That was a wonderful one. And there were several about Alzheimer's that I read. Tuesdays with Maury, I read. I wanted this book to be a bit more academic than that. And I read Casey Lehman's Heavy, Cheryl Strayed's Wild, really any memoir I could get my hands on. And what I learned was that the best memoirs are the ones that are most authentic in terms of the voice. And so if you don't remember something, it's really important to let the reader know that you don't remember it, or if your memory has, how shall we say, metamorphosed the event over time, to acknowledge that. And so I worked hard to do that, and also worked hard not to look away from the hardest things that my father experienced. And that was probably the hardest thing of all, trying to remember the really difficult moments in his disease that I had turned away from during the time that he was sick.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Bruce, can I ask you to reflect on how Cindy's and her father's experience of his dementia have changed if he were to come and seek out help and a diagnosis for memory problems today versus in the 1980s?
I think it would have been very different. And I think we really want to find cures for these diseases, and we're not quite there yet. But I think the funding for research into these diseases has been relatively delayed, and only in the last 2 or 3 years has NIH had a kind of budget that you can start thinking about big impact. So I think first it would have been diagnosis. I think in those days, everything was Alzheimer's disease. And that approach has failed at every level. I think the pharmaceutical industry approached all dementia like it was Alzheimer's disease. And then they found out a third of people in some of their clinical trials didn't have Alzheimer's disease. I think we've thought a lot more about risk factors for different subtypes of Alzheimer's disease. I have to tell a story about Caltech, which a comment one of your scientists made. I think she's with us tonight, Mary Kennedy. But when I was at UCLA, I began to get interested in whether there were premorbid traits of people that might predispose them to certain forms of dementia. And I think there are. And, I think that was a hint that maybe the way we lived our lives and what we were enriched in to some extent might have protected us. And Mary Kennedy told me, she said, a lot of my, postdocs are dyslexic. And I think she really captured this asymmetry that so many of us have. And, so I think, to be a brilliant visual scientist, it may require that you use parts of the left hemisphere that we ordinarily use for reading to do visual things. And so going back to Cindy's dad, Jerry, he would now be called, and Cindy writes about it eloquently in her book, not just Alzheimer's disease, but a logopenic variant of Alzheimer's disease, which meant that he didn't start with a memory problem. He started with a problem with words. And I think he carried this vulnerability. He didn't read in other ways. He was extraordinary. And perhaps, I think we've learned that this form of Alzheimer's disease, there is overrepresentation of people who don't work with words. So it is this very idea that maybe early in life, the way we behave, and throughout our lifetime, there may be relative protections against these illnesses. I think the care would have been very different. What I can tell about Jerry, he was badly neglected in nursing facilities. This still happens today. He was swamped with medicines that were probably not good for him. I spend as much time with caregivers when I make a diagnosis as I do the patient. And I think we've realized that a lot of the impact of these diseases are on people like Cindy and her mom. And that's another person that we need to intervene in terms of protection. So I think we have gotten really good at diagnosis during life. The old myth that you can't diagnose someone until you look at the brain is almost disappeared. With all of our biomarkers, we can tell you with precision whether you are starting to develop Alzheimer's disease 15, 20 years before you ever get sick. So I think this is going to be a huge way that we start to make inroads early in these illnesses when we get smart therapies and start to make a difference.
I appreciate what you said about the other casualties of dementia, namely Cindy and her mother. And Cindy, could you say something about what you learned, either both at the time and then through writing this book, that could help people be good to their loved ones while also taking necessary care of themselves at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. I think one of the ways a caregiver can take care of herself is to pay attention to what's happening to their loved one. And what I mean by that is my father had various symptoms, and Bruce alluded to the 15 or 20 years before the illness fully presents or is so in your face that you can't ignore it. But there are signs, and I don't mean to frighten anyone, but there are things to pay attention to. For example, sleep issues. Sleep, as we all know, is incredibly important. You feel better after a good night's sleep. There's a lot of really interesting research happening all over the world, and especially at UCSF, on the ways in which sleep provides the brain with an opportunity to clean out the toxins that accumulate. And so if a person is having difficulty sleeping, you want to intervene. Another symptom that my father had in what's called the prodromal stage was hearing. Again, there's a lot of research going on around hearing. If a loved one needs hearing aids, make sure that you get to work on that. The idea being that if a person doesn't hear, they get more isolated. Isolation is very bad for the brain. So these are just a couple of interventions for the person who may be having difficulties, but I think that those interventions actually have a really positive effect on the caregiver. Because if your loved one is sleeping better, you will sleep better. If your loved one is hearing better, you won't get into so many arguments. And then I think the final thing I would suggest is if someone you love is acting differently, as in, I would just say, seems more depressed than usual or apathetic, isn't enjoying the things that the person used to enjoy, we mistakenly chalk that up in my father's case to, oh, he's depressed. He sold his business. my parents were moving from New Jersey to Florida. There were so many big transitions that explained the depression. And I write about this, but one of the most interesting moments in my year at UCSF was when Bruce gave a presentation and talked about how depression isn't necessarily a reaction to a problem, but is the problem or is part of the problem. And so getting that person on some kind of SSRI, if that's what the doctor or the neurologist suggests, all these interventions will make the caregiver's life better. So that's how I would respond to your question.
I consider that a very selfless response. But I also, being a caregiver for someone with dementia, I completely agree. And that was something also that really struck me in the book too, Bruce, was when you mentioned that we tend to think of depression as a response to the disease, not as a symptom of it. And that just really leapt out at me and made so much sense, that it really is these various changes in the brain can be a part of the dementia and not simply reactions to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend in our society to tend to say, well, this person with Alzheimer's got depressed. Well, wouldn't you get depressed? And the answer is, well, a lot of people don't get depressed. And on the other hand, we have some degenerative diseases like the Parkinsonian dementias, where people who would never, ever be depressed get depressed and anxious. And what I like to say is that's sometimes the beginning of the disease in parts of the brain that generate anxiety and mood. And so I think it's never simple, and certainly people can get depressed because of their state. But I also think it's really important for, especially as we start thinking about interventions, for people to understand that a first onset of psychosis at age 50 might well be the beginning of a Parkinsonian dementia. It might happen before the Parkinson's disease.
Thanks. Before I turn it over to the audience for a Q&A, I wanted to ask you both one final question, and that's that you have written a book together, which is a strange and wonderful and intimate thing. And I just was wondering if either of you had a lingering question or two that you might want to ask the other about your collaboration and your relationship.
Bruce, do you want to go first?
Well, the question, and it's unresolved for Cindy and I, is what is the next project? And so we think a lot about that, but I don't think this will be the last thing we do together. And, you know, I'd also point out, I mean, Cindy's interest in diversity at Caltech was one of the reasons we were excited that she joined us. And, you know, and I think she teaches English brilliantly. So there are lots of ways that we're thinking of interacting, both through education, but probably another book as well. So, but that's the unresolved question.
That's great.
I think I probably have the same question. I'm working on a book on Edgar Allan Poe, and I don't think Bruce is going to want to co-author that one with me. So we're trying to figure out next steps. But I noticed that Mary Kennedy asked a question about dementia in relation to the pandemic, in relation to isolation. That may be something that we're going to want to talk about at some point, but still trying to figure that one out.
Well, that is a good cue for me to turn it over to Corinne, who I think is going to be handling the audience Q&A, if I have that right. And I just want to thank both Cindy and Bruce for letting me participate in this. It's been interesting and a great experience reading the book and talking with you both. So thank you.
Thank you. Very generous. Thank you.
Well, everybody, this is your chance to ask questions, and you're welcome to raise your hand and ask them directly, and I'll call on you. Or if you would prefer, you can just write them into the chat and we'll call them out. We'll start right away. There was a question entered earlier from Elise saying, as a reader, I was led into many relationships in this book, starting with the one between Cindy and Bruce. It begins when Cindy asks Bruce to co-author a story she wants to tell. Then at least once in the book, Bruce asks Cindy to write a specific chapter. And Elise is wondering, how did the conceiving and writing bring you each surprises? And what happened in the book that was unexpected?
I love that question. I had written a couple of draft chapters going into the year at UCSF. I wasn't exactly sure what the rest of the book was going to look like, and crossed my fingers and toes that learning some neurology would help me figure that out. Little did I know that Bruce had some very clear ideas about what chapters should be in the book, and every time he was right. He said, Cindy, my expertise is in frontotemporal dementia. The hallmark of that disease, if I can use a singular hallmark, is behavioral change. Talk about your father's behavior. And that was a hard assignment for many reasons. I was far away from what I call the scene of the crime and didn't see a lot of the behaviors. I heard about them, so it was very kind of secondhand. And the behaviors that I did see were so disturbing that I really didn't want to write about them. So that was a really hard chapter to write, but very important to write. It was in that chapter also that I started thinking about the pharmacy that my father had become, and what I describe as a kind of zombification of him, because in the 80s, that was the treatment. You just threw a lot of drugs into a person's system and crossed your fingers that you would knock them out for most of the day. So that was one big surprise in terms of the writing. But I think the biggest one was I had come into the program thinking that all dementia was about memory. And I learned that that was not true, that there were many different kinds of dementia, and some really didn't involve memory. I had thought that memory was going to be the first chapter of the book. Bruce said, let's talk about diagnosis first. And memory became the last chapter of the book. And that was in a conversation where Bruce said, you need a better arc to the narrative. Like you need to explain how you got from A to Z. And the memory chapter was a really important chapter to write. Each one was, but it was in writing that chapter that I realized that my father's forgetting had turned into my forgetting. And that in writing about memory, I remembered all these wonderful things about my father that had been too painful for me to remember. And so it was in that chapter that I really sort of got back in touch. And Kathy, this gets back to your earlier question, what was your father like? He participated in the temple. He often danced and he sang, and he loved Frank Sinatra, and he took me to the New York Knicks games, and we loved Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and his favorite drink was vodka and grapefruit juice. And I just remembered all of these things about my dad that had been kind of in the corner somewhere, but it was in writing that chapter that I felt almost like it was a symphony for my dad. And I owed that to Bruce.
So I'm going to answer this question also by taking on what Mary Kennedy wrote. And she said, Cindy's comment about isolation makes me wonder whether the pandemic year and half may have hastened some people's onset of dementia. So I just want to say a word about my mom and the picture behind me, which is my mom's picture. I'll say a word about that in a second. But this has been the most horrible year, I think, in the history of this planet for people with who are in nursing facilities. My mother lived 94 glorious years, and the last year that she lived, she died during the writing of this. She was isolated. She'd had a stroke, had to go into a facility. No one could go to see her. The loneliness was absolutely unbearable. There isn't a doubt in my mind that, you know, this was multiplied millions fold, even worse in South America. So yes, for fascination, so all of the risk factors for COVID are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And so these two diseases came together, and the way we look after elderly people, the way we look after prisoners, led to massive epidemics among the people that we're trying to protect, the elders, the people who deserve, you know, this attention. And so, yes, and we're going to have to rethink this, I think, over and over again to prevent anything like what has happened with COVID over the last 2 years. So for me, the chapter that was the most difficult, the most fun, I learned the most was the one about memory. And I realized that the language that we use to explain memory isn't very good. We don't understand it very well as scientists. We don't know how people consolidate memories, how they get back to them. And in the course of thinking about writing this, I looked at one of my mom's paintings, which is The Life and Death of Billy Miller. And the picture behind me, she loved dogs. He was an Australian Shepherd. And she walked with him with my dad, but then after my dad died, and park along the ocean in San Pedro for years. And what this picture shows is, you know, his birth in squares. Each one of these squares is like a memory. And then the summation of all of those walks, every single walk is summated into palm trees. But how we actually do that and how we take all of this information in our common everyday experiences and put it into the brain and keep it there is something that I realize we don't understand at all. So writing the memory chapter, Cindy kept saying to me, write more about yourself, which was really hard for me. And, you know, I'm a neurologist and, you know, I have my deficits. And, anyways, I wrote a bit about my mom and my dad in that chapter about memory, and it brought up memories that I had never dealt with, just like Cindy had talked about. So for me, I learned so much from the writing of Cindy every chapter, but the memory one was really interesting for me.
Thank you both. Nicole asks a question that I also have on my mind. So two of her sisters were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it makes her anxious about that and wondering, is Alzheimer's in the genes?
I think my friend Giovanni Coppola, who's studied this quite a bit, thinks that about 60%, and this was before we started to realize that there were risk factors in our environment, like air pollution. And so we think 50–60% is strongly driven by the genes that we inherit. There's some genes that cause it. So if you carry a presenilin 1 gene, you will get Alzheimer's disease. It starts at 45, and by the time that you're 55, you're in the last stages. So there's some causal genes. There are other genes that increase our susceptibility to this strongly. About 20% of us carry a gene called ApoE4. If we have that variant of E, about 20% of us do, we are 2 to 3 times more likely to get Alzheimer's. If we get 2 of them, probably 20 times more likely. But that's not most Alzheimer's disease. So I think we all carry genetic susceptibilities, but there is such an important story, as Cindy touched on, about sleep and exercise and preventing stroke and all of these things that, you know, interact with the genes. And our audience, I'm sure, is well aware of these. And I think this is one of the reasons that we're seeing a little drop in the dementia rates in people who are older. It's because we get it now.
Thank you. I might be mispronouncing this. Is it Anna or Anna? Did you want to unmute and ask this question yourself, or do you want me to read it?
That's okay. Yeah, this is Anna. Yeah, I just have a question. My father got dementia in his 80s, and he was in a very deep decline. But there was one thing that I observed was that while he could not ask a question, his cognitive skills were very low, and he could not maintain a conversation. But his emotional reactions, his judgment, and some of his short responses were almost the same as before. And they were very characteristic and special of him, of his personality and judgment. And I just wondered if that happens, if you observed it before, because I found that fascinating.
Oh, what a great question. So I think Alzheimer's, it spares the frontal lobes, and usually until later in the illness, people are very much themselves. And sometimes they're even better in the early stages. They become more sensitive, they listen better. So I think, yes, with this illness in particular, I think the people's personality is very preserved. And I hope Cindy would comment on her dad, because I think he was very much himself as well for a long time.
Yes, he was always a very empathic person and never lost that. So when I learned about frontotemporal dementia, where a person really becomes unrecognizable because of what's happening in their brain. So I remember watching a video of this couple in a doctor's office, and the wife was weeping because her husband was sick and the husband was laughing. And that made me think, okay, so dad didn't have that. His empathy circuitry was intact and maybe even deeper than earlier in his life. And I talk about that in one of the chapters. And I know other people who have written about this disease say the same thing, that even though the person may not know who you are, technically speaking, they know that you are someone they love. And I never lost that with my father. Lost just about everything else, but that being the most important thing never disappeared. And that was huge. And I was able to hang on to that for a very long time.
Wonderful. Michael, would you like to read your question?
Sure. I was curious. Many people get informed while they're still quite functional that they have Alzheimer's. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about how people are reacting to that news today, and how medical science is helping them go through that early stages of Alzheimer's.
Well, my comment would be this is probably the most exciting time in terms of therapies that we've ever witnessed in Alzheimer's. I hope that people in the earliest stages are participating in clinical trials. I think we've come close. I'm not convinced that we have budged this very much yet with the current drug that is going to be that is FDA approved. But I think we are getting closer and closer to changing the trajectory. And, I think whenever there is hope like that, when I talk to people, I talk about a year. And I usually say with the interventions we have, and I think everybody has to see somebody who's serious about this, I think that this will be a good year. And I think we can preserve where you are for about a year. With these new therapies, it may even be better. So I think anyone with the beginnings of this disease, massive support for the caregiver, the loved one, the family, but also beginning to think about clinical trials. This is a very important time, history of Alzheimer's.
I would just add something that I learned in the course of being at UCSF that's kind of a no-brainer, but I think worth sharing. And that is that whatever is good for your body is good for your brain. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. So if you are on the Mediterranean diet, say, because you have a cholesterol issue, that will help your brain. If you exercise because you think it's going to help your body, great, but it will also help your brain. And to think about the brain as sort of one more muscle that you need to take care of, I think is important. I mean, for me, I always sort of had separated out the brain from the rest of the body. But one of the things I learned at UCSF was that that's not such a good idea to do, that they really go hand in hand. So I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you. So this one is sort of a comment to when you said looking for another project, but maybe there's also stuff that you can share about it already. Victoria asks, she said, for the next project, how about the interactions between the arts and Alzheimer's research and treatment? And I think that's a lovely topic. Is that something you have already been looking into or have information you can share on that front?
Bruce, you've done a lot of work on that already. Do you want to talk about that?
So one of the things that has fascinated me, it was a small part of my work, but increasingly bigger, is the realization that some people with degenerative diseases actually, it stimulates their creativity. If you get a progressive loss of language on the left side, we see a disproportionate number of people who make profound artistic creations. And so this is sort of counterintuitive, but I think it's explaining how the brain works. If one system turns off, another system may turn on. And so I think there's lots to think about in terms of the humanity of people with these illnesses. And I think only artists can tell that story. I mean, Cindy has told it with her dad so beautifully. You know, and I think artists are approaching this in so many different ways. We have an artist now named Mick O'Kelly from Ireland who wants to change the environment in nursing facilities in a really smart way. So Cindy and I may well do something about the arts and the brain and try to bring this to a broader audience. It's a really great idea.
That'd be wonderful. Does anyone else want to raise their hand and ask a question or enter it into the chat? This is your moment, and maybe it's not a question, maybe it's something that the book brought up for you. Jane, I see your hand is raised. You go right ahead.
Okay. What about music in the treatment of people with Alzheimer's? What is your experience with that?
Well, this is a passion of Francis Collins, who is head of the National Institute of Health. And he set up a whole study group, I'm part of it, to think about how we might prove that our artistic interventions through music might actually protect the brain. Does it protect people emotionally? I think so. Could we prove that? I think we could. Is it slowing the progression of the disease? Not clear, but it's pretty clear that if you take up music when you're young, you have a different brain structure. better in terms of the area underneath the motor strip where you play the violin. So I think music, the arts, as protective or maybe as healing in certain ways to the emotional deficits we get is a very hot topic. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that. It's a great question.
And I would just add, Oliver Sacks writes about the relationship between music and brain health. He's really eloquent on that. Several of the people in the cohort that I was a part of used music in the dementia nursing homes. People who couldn't speak a sentence were able to access songs. They could play drums. And so this is a huge area, I think, that people are pursuing, those who want to try and move away from medication as the be all and end all. So having music, having pets, bringing in support animals, if you can, to the assisted living home. I'm absolutely positive that would have been so beneficial for my father. We had a dog when we were little, and either he would have thought that it was that dog, or he just would have been really happy with any dog. So there are all these creative ways of accessing sort of different parts of the brain that people are thinking about at the same time as the science is looking into the biomarkers and this new FDA medication, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, you know, it's a problem that needs to be looked at from all different perspectives, including the artistic one.
Thank you. We have a great question from Julie. In the chat, I'm gonna read it out. Bruce, you spoke about treatment of the caretaker along with the patient. What are some recommendations for the caregivers?
Yeah, I'm glad that that question was asked, and Cindy's touched on this. I mean, I think we our nurses just are incredible in this space, and I think they are doing interventions like meditation and formally looking at. With one of our dementias, frontotemporal dementia, the caregiver burden is so high that you can really predict, based on the structural changes of the patient's brain, the degree of physical health and also mental health changes that happen with the disease. So I think working on exercise interventions, one of our emotion scientists, Virginia Sturm, is looking at all walks and looking at what happens to caregivers who spend 15 minutes in nature thinking about the glory of it all. And she showed that they even changed, after that all walk, the type of picture that they did. It included much less of them and much more of the space around them. So I think, you know, but for some people, particularly low socioeconomic people, you know, getting respite, getting time away, getting time to themselves, because we see these people die. I mean, they die caregiving, and that's the triple tragedy of Alzheimer's.
Thank you. So I'm going to toss it back to Kathy and Michael if there's any. Otherwise, thank you all so much, and we'll see if there's any last comments there, Catherine or Michael.
Catherine, do you have anything that you wish to add, or any questions you want to ask of our two guests?
I feel like I had my fair share of time. I do just want to recommend the book. I'm sure there are many people tonight who have or have had a parent or loved one who has dementia. And this is, you know, this is not an academic analysis. It helps you to, I think, assess your relationship to your parents or loved one's illness in a way that, for me at least, wasn't really happening before I read the book. So I'm very grateful for it.
Well, and I just would add, in terms of that last question, having been the primary family caregiver for my mother's Alzheimer's. She was in a facility, but I was the family member that was responsible for her. And my advice to everybody, and it's a harsh bit, but it is, you've got to marshal your emotional energies because you don't know how long you're going to need them. And when Bruce mentioned that caregivers die sometimes in the process of giving care, we have to be careful not to, because we don't know how long we're going to be needed. We have to be very careful about our own emotional well-being in that process. I really want to thank Professors Cindy Weinstein, Professor Bruce Miller, and Professor Catherine Yurka for a most interesting evening. I can't encourage people enough to read the book. It's fortunately going to be in Vroman's for those of us in the Pasadena area. I'm sure that there are going to be a number of other stores that will be carrying it. And of course, it's available online. I also want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to thank the following for their support as well: the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union, the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, and the Caltech Office of Strategic Communication. Thanks also to the staff of Event Productions, General Manager Ed Brown, our House Manager Corrine Shore, our Stage Manager Dwayne Miles, and the others from Academic Media Technology who have supported many of our online presentations in the past over the last year and a half. And also to the public programming staff, Kara Stemmen, Regina Cabrera, and Mary Herrera. Finding the Right Words, a story of literature, grief, and the brain is something that I'm going to encourage all of us to read. It was just published, as Catherine mentioned, just 2 days ago. This program will be archived on the Caltech events website. Remember, you can keep informed about the performing arts events, authors' presentations, and science talks by visiting events.caltech.edu. And thank you for joining us tonight, and to Professors Weinstein, Miller, and Yurka for being with us and sharing a most informative evening. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.